The U.S. is drawing down its military forces in Iraq from 5,200 to 3,000, according to the commander of the U.S. Central Command in West Asia. The news comes as Trump faces backlash over allegations that he called U.S. troops losers and suckers, and as he trails his opponent, former Vice President Joe Biden, in the polls just weeks ahead of the November 3 presidential election. The announcements also came 2 days after Trump accused Pentagon leaders of waging wars to ensure contractors stay happy. General Frank McKenzie, commander of U.S. Central Command, said the force reduction in Iraq is due to the great progress the Iraqi forces have made and in consultation and coordination with the government of Iraq and the U.S. coalition partners. McKenzie failed to explain if by progress he meant the Iraqi counterterrorism services, which have recently taken part in several high-profile operations against the only power in Iraq capable of eliminating Daesh, that is the Popular Mobilization Units. McKenzie also failed to explain if their move was per the Iraqi parliament's vote to obligate Iraq's government to work towards ending the presence of all foreign troops on Iraqi soil. The vote that represented a rebuke of the United States over its illegal targeted assassination of Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad International Airport, along with the deputy director of the Popular Mobilization Forces, Haj Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. The attack that sharply escalated tensions with Iran, leading to a mega fireworks show at the US-occupied Ain al-Assad airbase in Iraq, pushing Americans to reconsider their true presence in the region. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. The top U.S. general in the Middle East, Frank McKenzie, confirmed plans for partial troop drawdowns in both Iraq and Afghanistan before the November 3rd election, as President Donald Trump seeks to fulfill a campaign promise to end what he calls America's endless wars. The U.S. plans to cut the troop presence in Iraq from 5,200 to 3,000 by the end of September. To discuss this issue with us from London is Patrick Henningsen, founder of the 21st Century Wire News website. Thank you for being with us, Patrick. Now, the decision to reduce the 5,200 troops now in Iraq comes 3 weeks after Trump met in Washington with Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who is the new Iraqi prime minister, in part to complete details of this drawdown, which supposedly will happen at the end of this month. We know the U.S. never does anything that goes against its interests here or anywhere in the world, to be honest. Is this truly only for the votes, or is there something else that we might be actually missing?
I think that this has been on the cards for quite a while, certainly since the last administration, but more so since what happened in January 2020, when Iran demonstrated in quite dramatic fashion what it can do to strengthen its own interests, its own security perimeter in the region with the 2 missile strikes against 2 U.S. bases. But the announcement is definitely timed for the election. This is very important in U.S. politics for an incumbent president to be able to go to the electorate and say that I've made good on some of my platform promises in 2016 that he got elected to. This would be a way for him to win back the hearts and minds of some of his base that has really drifted because of some of the terrible, quite frankly, foreign policy decisions that he's also made in the last 4 years. So in light of his recent comments, however, offhanded as they might be, where he basically chastised the Pentagon for looking out for the interests of defense contractors, that does resonate with Trump's original base. So if you look at this in the context of the election, it does tend to make sense. Now, it is actually in the U.S. interests long-term, more than likely, to basically draw down troops in the region. It's not a very big difference. I think it's more symbolic from, 5,000 to 3,000 or something like this. But it's not in the U.S.'s long-term interest because the world's changing. However, it's not in the Israeli or the Saudi Gulf interest either for the U.S. to draw down its troops, because that weakens their position as well, precarious as it is in the region. But don't discount the possibility that there's also some trilateral geostrategic games going on with this administration, maneuvering for leverage vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, especially, and also even Israel as well. Israel is not, this administration's relationship is fluid with a lot of people that it might appear to be allies with in order to gain leverage to get certain other things done. So it remains to be seen long term what it means.
We did hear General McKenzie, who's the commander of the U.S. Central Command in West Asia, saying that improvements in the Iraqi military's campaign against the Islamic State, he means Daesh, enabled the Pentagon to make the additional troop cuts. When he says improvements in the Iraqi military campaign, I cannot but think about the operation that happened a couple of months back when the Iraqi authorities actually raided Popular Mobilization Unit forces, who are the only forces in Iraq capable of defeating Daesh. Does this mean that the U.S. is brewing something for Iraq next?
Well, it is remotely possible that this administration has prompted some kind of a sea change in thinking. Again, I think this is more because of the change in geopolitics in the region, the emergence of the arc of resistance, for instance. So they are reacting to the changes in the region, the emergences of a collective defense pact that could entail Iran, Iraq, and its allies, Syria, for instance. That does change the game a lot. So there's more earnest, probably more practical thinking going on in light of this. But you have to remember, for all its faults, the Trump administration inherited the ISIS project from the Obama and Hillary Clinton administration. So the previous administration really created and nourished Daesh, ISIS. And really, if you go back to the Bush administration before that, to create the conditions with which a insurgent movement could thrive out of Iraq. But the central issue, of course, is the People's Mobilization Units, the Hashd al-Shabi, actually, because this basically, the existence of the PMUs eliminates any possibility for ISIS to really exist in any meaningful way in Iraq. Plus, the Shiite characteristic of it does threaten Israelis' interests. It threatens Saudi Gulf interests and so forth, and the fact they're allied so closely with Iran and have that sort of support. So, but the most important thing with the PMUs as well is the Iraqi-Syrian border. Okay,
this is where it gets interesting, Patrick.
Daesh to move back and forth.
We have more than 700 American troops in Syria at the moment, mostly in the country's northeast, to supposedly protect the oil. From what? I don't know. But as per Trump's declaration, they want to protect that oil. How come they are not involved in the troop cuts?
The numbers in Syria in terms of U.S. troops, it's nominal, really. They're really there as a casus belli. It's almost like bait. They're hoping that the Syrian or the Russian forces have some sort of firefight or exchange, and then they could divert the conversation into some dramatic national security crisis away from the real reason which they're there. Is they're playing a dangerous three-way game with Turkey, with the Kurdish forces that the United States has been backing for years there. But really, that force is there, that those U.S. troops are there squatting on Syria's oil fields as an unofficial part of maximum pressure policy. In other words, strangling Syria. You add sanctions to this, basically a global embargo against Syria, and you take away their fuel supply, their energy supply, you increase the economic pressure.
Well,
That's
I have
they're
just
there.
2 minutes left, Patrick, and I want to discuss with you the hypocrisy, the show of drawdowning 2,000 troops out of the 5,200 in Iraq, because there are at any given time 45,000 to 65,000 American troops in the region spread between Jordan and Oman, assigned to operate 8 airfields, run key headquarters, sail warships, and fly warplanes, and stage for deployments to places such as Iraq and Afghanistan. So how possible is it that the tax-paying American cannot see that their troops are just part of the problem in West Asia and they can just be redeployed after the elections?
Well, you don't forget Qatar, Bahrain, Turkey, Incirlik Air Force Base, Erbil in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Djibouti, which is a Middle Eastern staging ground.
The Fifth
where
Fleet
Diego
in Bahrain,
Garcia.
Udeid Air Base in Qatar, as you said, Djibouti, Ethiopia, all across the region.
Yeah, so the American taxpayers don't see it like that, mainly because the media in the United States, led by CNN and some of these networks, they don't articulate the situation in that way. Of course, no U.S. politicians are talking about it in an anti-imperialist fashion, but the U.S. moves like an elephant. So this isn't a Vietnam situation where they'll be on the top of the embassy in Saigon, evacuating by helicopters. They have assets and infrastructure that's deeply baked in the region. They have really infiltrated some of these countries in a very deep way. So you've seen a glimpse of what could happen in January with the Iranian missile strikes. Mm-hmm. That's a harbinger of the future. So the U.S. will eventually have to move its assets back onshore and return to a kind of reactionary force deployment, and then relying on proxies as well to be local enforcers.
Well,
that's just a reality moving into the future. How it happens and how it unfolds.
It remains to be seen, Patrick, especially with the ongoing peace, so-called accords being signed here and there in the region, which could actually ignite the entire region. I want to thank you very much, Patrick Henningsen, founder of the 21st Century Wire News website, for joining us to talk about the possible troop cuts in Iraq and mainly Afghanistan as well. Thank you. Please stay tuned for our next segment. Now, the announcement that Bahrain would establish full diplomatic relations with Israel leaves open the possibility that more Arab states will follow. But this latest Arab-Israeli rapprochement is neither a bolt from the blue nor the result of months of delicate shuttle diplomacy by the Trump administration. Israel and the Arab leaders in the region, in the Persian Gulf, had been quietly cultivating ties for many years. As a matter of fact, since the British founding of these regimes in the second half of the 20th century. More on Arabs betraying Palestine in this following report. Bahrain agreed to establish formal relations with Israel in advance to this week's expected signing in Washington of an accord to normalize ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It is now likely that a second accord could be signed between Israel and Bahrain. U.S. President Donald Trump tweeted the news Friday after he spoke by phone to both Bahrain's King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa and Israeli regime's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Another historic breakthrough today. Our two great friends, Israel and the Kingdom of Bahrain, agreed to a peace deal, the second Arab country to make peace with Israel in 30 days, Trump tweeted. This regional treachery is seen as a diplomatic achievement by President Trump and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, who largely brokered the agreements with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. Trump did not take long before he framed his international deal-maker credentials for his election campaign as a harbinger of Middle East peace and prosperity, without mentioning that this non-existent peace will not be touching upon Palestinian lives, and that the prosperity he mentioned will only be for the puppet Arab regimes and never for the people. This normalization parade will only serve Trump to deflect attention from the deal of the century that he failed to achieve, Israeli-Palestinian peace. That project, which was widely criticized as heavily slanted in Israel's favor and rejected by all Palestinians. Focusing outward with this peace show is the Trump administration's way of telling the Palestinians they can no longer dictate the region's relations with Israel. Yet, the Americans and the Israelis fail to fathom that it is always the people who dictate these relations and not the regimes. Jordan and Egypt are great examples. Show me a Zionist freely roaming the streets of Cairo and Amman, and I'll believe that these peace deals have removed Palestine from the hearts and minds of the Arab population. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Ali Murad, who is a political commentator. Thank you for joining us, Ali. Now, peace deals being signed faster than Trump had ever imagined in West Asia, without even any shuttle diplomacy that touches upon anything related to the Palestinian rights and the Palestinian demands. However, Israel and the Gulf, the Persian Gulf Arab states began establishing tentative links together since the 70s. What can they gain by open relationships like these when the people are against it?
Actually, the infrastructure for these relations exists, as you said, since the 70s. The Israelis and those Persian Gulf Arab state leaders have been building those relations. So nothing new when we want to assess the profits on both sides, whether economically, technologically, in the fields of development and etc. Though those leaders and monarchs and princes are trying to say that they are going to bring more prosperity and development for their people, I think that the major profit here goes to the United States of America. The Trump administration chose to reveal this move before 50 or 60 days from the US elections. The administration in Washington believes that the profits the Trump campaign is going to benefit from these moves would be extreme. So, and it's also is going to help Netanyahu. Plus, you got the profits that the American establishment is going to gain, because there is an old project in the region. It dates back 20 years ago to make a big bloc in the region led by Israel, the Zionist entity, and it also has Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and all those betraying nations or regimes to be inside this bloc, or you can call it alliance, to stand in the face of the axis of resistance that made a lot of victories during the last years in many places. It's always about the Zionist entity. The profit is they want to protect the Zionist entity from any dangers that they think that the Zionist entity is going to fade or to weaken more, because it's obvious that the Israelis lost the ability to win wars. So they think that they have to strengthen Israel by bringing all those monarchies and regimes to try to protect Israel in the future.
But Mr. Adli, the links grew stronger in the past decade between these entities, between the Israelis and the Persian Gulf Arab states, who made common cause over Iran, basically, and secondly, the axis of resistance. But in 2015, the UAE allowed Israel to establish a diplomatic presence inside of the UAE at the something called the International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi, and Qatar worked with Israel to broker what they called a ceasefire in the blockaded enclave of the Gaza Strip, and the Sultanate of Oman played host to the Prime Minister of the Israeli entity, Benjamin Netanyahu, in 2018 before he passed away. Whom do you think will be next to submit to the Israelis in this Arab world, and why? What would they gain from that?
There are a lot of rumors nowadays after the Bahraini move. I think there are a lot of Arab countries that are candidates to declare the normalization with the Zionist entity. But I think there are two major Arab states here that are expected to declare this, because at least there is one more Arab state that will declare normalization with the Zionist entity before November 3rd. Mm-hmm. Yes. So it might be the Sultanate of Oman or the Sudan, mm-hmm. because as if you take a look at the Pompeo visit, the last visit to the West Asia region, Pompeo went to Tel Aviv, then he went directly to Khartoum, to Sudan. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then he made his Persian Gulf Arab states visit. So I think Sudan is the most probable candidate to be the third Arab state to declare normalization with the Zionist entity.
That most definitely will be very tricky, since the majority of the Sudanese population is against this normalization. However, Saudi Arabia has already taken symbolic steps, and we're talking about the biggest player here, by allowing Israeli commercial flights to use the Saudi airspace. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the country's de facto ruler, suggested he is open to recognizing Israel. But in the event of such a move, how do you think the Muslim world that prioritizes the Palestinian cause will react to the Saudi move in specific?
If you take a look now at the Islamic world and you try to assess the power and the influence of Saudi Arabia, you will realize without any without any difficulty that the Saudis have lost their influence from Indonesia in the east to Morocco in the west. The Saudis, because they wanted to push Mohammed bin Salman to the leadership, the price was that Saudi Arabia was weakened. And because of the adventures MBS has made in the region, the war in Yemen, the dispute with Qatar, and the actions against Lebanon and also in Libya, those factors all made Saudi Arabia weak. So I think that this move is going to be a killer for Saudi Arabia. This is why bin Salman is trying to calibrate the exact, the most timing, the timing that would benefit him or lessen the consequences and the reactions, because bin Salman in the end, he has the so-called Arab Peace Initiative that was left by his uncle King Abdullah, and he is dealing with this initiative as a burden. He wants to take away this burden. How he is doing this? He is pushing Bahrain to declare normalization, pushing United Arab Emirates, probably pushing Sudan, and later on pushing other Arab countries that he provides with money and has influence on them. So he would come out and say the majority of Arabs want to make peace before having the Palestinian rights. So I have to go with the majority of the Arabs and declare this.
One last question before we end off with the UAE-Israeli deal. Israel now has a foothold so close to the Islamic Republic of Iran that it threatens Iranian national security. How do you think this will be played out in the regional geopolitics?
I think it's a dangerous game those Persian Gulf Arab states are doing, because if they think that they can do just as Syria or Lebanon has done, because if you take a look at the map, Iran with its allies is present on the so-called borders of the Israeli entity. From Syria, the Golan Heights, and South Lebanon through the Islamic resistance in Lebanon. I'm talking about the project, not the physical existence of the Iranians on these borders. They can't do it to Iran by bringing those Zionists with their infrastructure to be placed in face of the Iranians in Bahrain or in the United Arab Emirates or even in Saudi Arabia, because they know there would be certain circumstances, any aggressive move from the Israelis in the future would be initiated from the lands of Emirates or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia that would attack the inside land of Iran would be met with retaliatory reaction, of course, because Tehran through the last 3 years threatened or warned United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia a lot of times.
We did see that, especially when one plane was launched from Qatar, for example, and another one from the UAE to threaten Iranian national security. I want to thank you very much, Ali Murad, political commentator, for being with us to talk about this issue. Thank you for being here, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.